Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to systematically dismantle pretty much everything you thought you knew about the origins of the Great War. You know, we usually think of history as this immovable object, just a series of inevitable events set in stone. But right now, we're going to look really closely at the evidence, examine the actual decisions made behind closed doors, and uncover a story that's honestly way more chaotic and shocking than whatever standard textbook narrative we all learned in school.
So let's just dive right into a seriously provocative question, one that might completely change how you view modern history. What if the First World War wasn't actually the first? We're going to challenge the very name of the conflict itself. But before we take a massive step back to look at centuries of history, we've got to start where the story traditionally begins.
Part 1. The Spark and the Powder Keg. This is where the story begins.
We almost always start with the standard textbook narrative, right? Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Historians call these the MAIN causes. And the assumption here is that these four vast structural forces acted like an irresistible tidal wave pushing Europe to war. You've got nationalism creating intense rivalries, imperialism driving competition for colonies, militarism expanding armies, and alliances slicing up the continent. The standard idea is that these sweeping forces made war absolutely unavoidable.
And then there's the spark itself. Struck on June 28, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. This single violent act in Sarajevo essentially handed the Austro-Hungarian Empire the exact excuse it needed to finally settle its long-standing disputes with Serbia.
What followed was a terrifying, rapid-fire domino effect of war declarations in less than a week. July 28th, Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, thinking it's going to be a short, localized war. But wait, Russia steps in to protect the Serbs. Then Germany, backing Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia on August 1st, and just 2 days later, they declare war on France. It looks like this unstoppable machine of war has just been switched on. But here's the catch. Was it really a machine?
Part 2. The Men Who Chose War. Let's look at human agency in 1914. To really grasp why this all happened, we have to look at the stark contrast between viewing history as an unstoppable automated machine versus the frankly terrifying reality of human agency. Instead of focusing solely on those massive structural causes, modern historical analysis points us toward small causes. We're talking about the specific, chaotic, and often panicked decisions made by extremely isolated individuals acting on their own fears. Because at the end of the day, nations don't just decide to go to war. People do.
Have you ever wondered who actually held the power to push the button back then? Well, in 1914, it was mere coteries of maybe 5 to 10 isolated men per nation making the ultimate choice. Think about that. Small groups, a monarch, a prime minister, a foreign minister, an army chief of staff. The general public, completely out of the loop. The fate of literally millions rested in the hands of a few dozen men scattered across 5 capitals.
And were these guys acting like master calculating chess players? Not even close. Rather than executing some brilliant scientific strategy, these tiny groups acted out of pure fear and panic. It was openly recognized as a blind leap. Actually, the German chancellor at the time, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, famously and terrifyingly called it exactly that, a leap in the dark. So chaos and confusion were running the show, absolutely not logic.
Part 3. The myth of binding alliances. Were they really binding contracts?
Okay, let's bust a major myth right now. If you look closely at the actual text of these treaties, you'll see they were absolutely full of loopholes. These alliances were an excuse, not some automatic doomsday machine. The common narrative tells us these treaties acted like a giant mousetrap. But for instance, the dual alliance was strictly defensive. And remember, Serbia didn't attack Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Plus, the Triple Alliance required members to step in only if a partner was attacked without direct provocation. And the ultimate proof of this? Italy. Italy literally read the fine print and just opted out, completely shattering the illusion of an unstoppable alliance domino effect. Because Austria-Hungary had clearly provoked Serbia, Italy correctly argued, hey, our treaty obligations aren't triggered here. So, no, the alliances didn't force anybody's hand. Those tiny groups of 5 to 10 men actively chose to go to war, and sometimes they completely ignore the actual text of their own treaties to do it.
Part 4. World War VII, not one. Time to look at a 500-year cycle.
Now, we're going to violently zoom out for a second. If we scientifically define a world war by its core parameters, meaning a conflict involving 5 or more major powers with military operations spanning 2 or more continents, a pretty shocking truth emerges. I mean, a true world war requires immense wealth to sustain massive armies and navies over vast distances, right?
Looking at the data, the conflict of 1914 was actually World War VII. It was just the latest in a long, incredibly well-funded cycle of global conflicts fought by wealthy empires. Just look at the timeline. From the War of the Grand Alliance back in 1689, right through the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. Every single one of these conflicts involved 5 or more major powers and stretched across the globe, from India all the way to the Americas. So the Great War of 1914, merely the 7th iteration of this devastating, highly expensive cycle.
Part 5. Trenches, U-boats, and America. How the U.S. entered the fray.
Bringing it back down to the devastating on-the-ground reality, let's examine the unique horrors of this 7th World War. The political patterns might have been centuries old, but the military technology of 1914 created an absolute nightmare. Millions of men fought and died for mere yards of muddy ground. Once the initial invasions halted, everyone dug in, and the conditions were horrific. Soldiers stood for weeks in freezing, wet mud, developing trench foot, which often led to amputations. They drank polluted water, got rampant dysentery, lived constantly among lice and rats, and faced relentless artillery bombardments that caused a devastating new psychological trauma we now know as shell shock.
Beyond the stagnant trenches, a sequential series of escalating provocations finally dragged the reluctant, neutral United States into the fray. First up, the British set up a massive naval blockade, severely restricting food to Germany. So Germany retaliates by unleashing a terrifying new weapon, the U-boat, famously sinking ships like the Lusitania, which killed 128 Americans. But the absolute final straw, the Zimmermann Note. This was a secret telegram where Germany literally proposed an alliance with Mexico to help them reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. After that, the U.S. simply could no longer stay out. Part 6. A devastating global legacy. Let's look at the human cost.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to step back and reckon with the staggering human cost, 8.5 million. What's truly terrifying is that this huge number represents only the military battle fatalities. 8.5 million soldiers died. Add to that an estimated 13 million civilian casualties. And remember, this almost unfathomable scale of slaughter was the direct result of blind leaps taken by just a handful of isolated men.
But somehow, even that massive number is totally eclipsed by this figure, 50 million. That's the estimated lives lost globally to the Spanish flu. And here's the kicker. That pandemic was heavily accelerated by the mass movement of all those troops. The virus spread like wildfire in 1918 and 1919 precisely because millions of men were packed shoulder to shoulder in the trenches and then shipped right back across the globe to their home continents, carrying the disease with them.
So, the crucial point you should take away from this explainer is actually a pretty heavy question about our present. Who currently holds the power to start World War VIII? Think about it. If the 7th World War was initiated by small, panic groups of men who just bypassed their own treaties and plunged the globe into unparalleled darkness, well, we really have to ask ourselves how much has actually changed today. Are the mechanisms of war still resting in the hands of the very few? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this completely changes how you view both the history and the future of global conflict.